And welcome to today's Wild Clearwater Country show here on KRFP Moscow Pullman. Want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us here on the Wild Clearwater Country show, which you can catch every Wednesday here from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific on KRFP Moscow Pullman. And I got a very special guest today. Adam Rissien, ReWilding Advocate of Wild Earth Guardians, is joining us on a video conference call and in a radio interview simultaneously. Adam is located in Missoula, Montana. And Adam, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day to be a guest here on the Wild Clearwater Country show. And before we get into this fantastic interview that's going to deal with rewilding efforts, first of all, what is rewilding on the National Forest, and then specific efforts here on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest. But first, please tell us about the important work you do, and then tell us about Wild Earth Guardians as a whole, Friends of the Clearwater and Wild Earth Guardians. We've been working closely together on some issues, and we will more in the future. So again, thanks for your time, and tell us a little bit about yourself and Wild Earth Guardians.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, Brett, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and all the listeners on the show. Again, my name is Adam Rissien. I am the Rewilding Advocate with Wild Earth Guardians, located here in Missoula, Montana. We are in one of 7 offices throughout the West, headquartered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but we work out of Denver and Portland and Seattle, and focus throughout the Western United States. And at Guardians, our mission is really to protect and restore wildlife, wild places, wild rivers, and the health of the American West. So, we envision a world where wildlife and wild places are respected and valued, and our world is sustainable for all beings. We believe in nature's inherent right to exist and thrive, and we fight for the wildlife, wild places, and waters that have been exploited and abused to serve the interest of a greedy few. So bit by bit, we're restoring the balance. Now, to achieve this vision, we have 4 primary programs: climate and energy, wildlife, wild rivers, and wild places, which is where we have the rewilding initiative, of which I focus on primarily as a rewilding advocate. Now, the mission of our rewilding initiative is to restore wildness to public lands scarred by decades of exploitation and mismanagement, and really to connect wildlife habitat and waterways across the American West through advocacy, education, and the effective use of the law. We are now, as always, a force for nature.
Yeah, that's great, Adam. Thank you so much. Well, I guess since this is kind of a double interview, audio and video, I just want to let those people that know that aren't familiar with me, which is a lot of people. I'm the Education Outreach Director for Friends of the Clearwater. I've been with the organization just over 10 years. We're based in Moscow, Idaho. And both professionally and personally, just kind of in a nutshell, I've been protecting and spending a lot of time in the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest since 2006. Just a little bit more about Friends of the Clearwater. FOC, or Friends of the Clearwater, was founded in 1987, and the truncated mission statement is to protect the public wildlands and rivers in the Clearwater Basin of beautiful north central Idaho through grassroots organizing, education, advocacy, and when necessary, litigation. Friends of the Clearwater is also a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And I guess on that note, Adam, this would be a good segue into what we're going to talk about the next 15, 20 minutes. And you know a lot about this, and I know a little bit about it. You have more specialty here, but there's a long legacy of harmful road building and logging on the National Forest system, but also here on the Nez Perce and Clearwater National Forest in north central Idaho. And can you please tell us why these roads were originally built? Maybe what they're generally used for, and who also maintains them?
Sure. Well, just foremost, and to put it out there, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, I'll call Nez Clear probably throughout the rest of our interview, so quite a mouthful. But it's one of the most important forests in the Northern Rockies because it has such a wide variety of wildlife habitat, and it's the linchpin for grizzly bear recovery of the species as a whole because it connects other recovery areas to what's called the Bitterroot Recovery Zone, which is currently officially uninhabited, but we know bears are returning there. So the Clearwater is super important, and the role of roads is also another really crucial issue. And I'll explain that here in a second, because most roads were constructed as part of logging and grazing and mining projects back when the forest's main focus was on resource extraction, though some would say it still is. But this was back when there were few restrictions on where you could really punch in a road. And that's why you find roads all over the place on this forest and many others. So this was way before the 1987 Forest Plan and even before the passage of the National Forest Management Act in 1976. You know, roads were also created by off-road vehicles driving cross-country, you know, pretty much anywhere someone could point their wheels. And in the late 1990s, the Forest Service simply added many of these roads to their system or placed them in some kind of limbo status, undetermined or whatnot, to be considered to be added to the system at a later date, which they did. So nowadays, you have most road construction proposed as temporary roads. And I put quotation marks around those because they're really not temporary. This is where the Forest Service is supposed to make sure the road gets removed after it's done being used, but often these roads never fully leave the landscape, and the Forest Service doesn't have a tracking system to ensure their removal or prevent them from being used again. In fact, the Forest Service often discovers these old roadbeds and then proposes to use them again and again. So according to the Nez Clear National Forest, there are, wait for it, 7,682 miles of road on this forest. To be clear, about 49% of those are closed or put in what the Forest Service calls long-term storage, which just means they're going to save these roads to be used sometime in the future. And by sometime in the future, we're talking like 10, 20, but more like 30 years out. You know, any reason to keep a road, the Forest Service will typically find to keep a road. Digging into the numbers a little further, you know, roughly 2,000 miles are actually open, but only for high clearance vehicles. Think logging trucks, Jeeps, you know, ATVs, certainly not any kind of regular car. Those roads, there's only 24%, about 1,800 miles that are safe for passenger cars to use. So the Forest Service still uses all these roads, like I said, primarily for resource extraction or exploitation, as we'll call it. This is logging and grazing and mining, but they'll also use roads for off-road vehicle recreation. And of course, we all use roads to access trailheads. So some roads, of course, have legitimate purpose and they need to be adequately maintained. We'll talk more about the maintenance in a little bit here. I know that was one of your questions.
Okay, yep. Well, it's funny, Adam. Well, there's actually nothing funny about it, but that, you know, the startling statistic that there's over 7,600 miles of roads on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest. As someone that grew up on the East Coast, I know driving cross country is a little bit over 3,000 miles. And so we have double the road mileage here on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest. And so folks, when we're talking about too many roads on the national forest or national forest, that's a good example. And so nonetheless, Adam, something that you and I are familiar with is, all of the studies that have come out that, they're generally steeped in the best available science that have revealed the various, let's say, negative impacts that roads have on watersheds, as well as fish and wildlife habitat. Can you please expand upon some of the more common impacts that roads and a very large road system on a national forest or forest may have?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the science is pretty definitive. There's no controversy that roads cause harm. In fact, there's an entire field of science that developed out of that fact called road ecology. So, like you said, there's numerous studies out there, and just, to go over some of the top line impacts, we're talking about, roads by their very nature erode. That means they send dirt into streams, and that's called sedimentation, and you'll hear me talk about that again. Roads also have these big pipes underneath them called culverts, and especially at stream crossings, they have these, so water can flow under the road and fish can swim through them. But oftentimes these culverts get clogged, they block fish passage, and then oftentimes they'll just completely fail. The culvert will get filled up, the water will flow over the road, and then the road just gets washed away. And we see this quite often on the Nez Clear because the forests get so much rain. Roads also increase the spread of noxious weeds. And at the landscape scale, roads fragment wildlife habitat, chopping it into smaller blocks that make it unsuitable for several different species. Roads create barriers to wildlife trying to move to more secure areas and forage for food. Roads make the harmful effects of climate change even worse, and they increase the chances of human wildfire ignitions. So those are just some of the handful of impacts that roads have, and those harmful effects aren't even a matter of controversy.
Yeah, there really is a ton of science out there. And the fact that there is a road ecology. I remember when I first started with Friends of the Clearwater 10 years ago, I remember speaking with someone how it'd be neat to get a degree in road ecology from the university and get into real wildland restoration work, such as what we're talking about, decommissioning roads. Not decommissioning roads affiliated or supplemented by additional logging, which is also true today on these national forests. Okay, so here on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, we have salmon, steelhead, and bull trout, which are all listed under the Endangered Species Act. And unfortunately, the extensive road system to which we're talking about, the roads have done much harm to these species over the decades, over the century. So I wanted to talk a little bit about riparian buffers, possibly talk a little bit about water quality standards and the roles that those play in terms of ensuring that crucial fish habitat is maintained at a high standard.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And before we delve into that, I was just reminded by your reference to decommissioning. I don't know that a lot of people understand what decommissioning is. And in fact, I find that even at the Forest Service, there's not a whole broad understanding of the types of decommissioning. So when we say decommission a road, what we're hoping for is that the road is just completely removed from the landscape. That is, the Forest Service brings in a heavy equipment operator and they recontour the original slope of the mountainside so that there is no road any longer. The roadbed's gone. And of course, you have to treat that area to make sure there's no noxious weeds that get in there. But this is what we hope would happen with decommissioning. Oftentimes, though, that's not what happens. The Forest Service has a whole suite of treatments that it can actually implement and still call a road decommissioned. And sometimes that just means blocking the entrance, removing the culverts, and then leaving it there to be rediscovered at some later date to be used all over again. That's why recontouring the road is actually the best way to not only get rid of it, but then to restore the ecological integrity that was there to begin with. So I know that's kind of a side note, but it's important when we're talking about how to accomplish true restoration. So getting back to riparian buffers, right?
You got it. Yep.
So let's define that for a minute. We have riparian buffers are strips of vegetation next to streams and rivers, typically with plants that like and need water, such as aspen and willow, cottonwood, and cedar. These areas also contain many shrubs and forbs that provide habitat for species that need wet, cool areas to thrive, such as toads and frogs and salamanders. Now, the buffer strips provide a wide range of benefits. They shade and cool the stream. They protect stream banks from eroding and reduce flood damage. They slow runoff for better summer stream flow. They filter sediment and other pollutants, and they just generally improve water quality. That last one is really important because under the Clean Water Act, each state must adopt water quality standards that define specific beneficial uses for each waterway, such as good habitat for fish and wildlife. To ensure waterways meet the standards, states establish specific criteria. They can be descriptive, or they can include numeric limits for specific pollutants. Now, if a pollutant exceeds the criteria, then the waterway gets labeled as impaired, and the state has to establish daily limits on the amount of the pollutant causing the problem, and this is where we hear about total daily maximum loads. Now, if all this sounds complicated, that's because it is complicated. The bottom line is that roads cause erosion that send sediment into streams, and sediment is a pollutant, and riparian buffers can trap the sediment if they're big enough and are intact and kept intact. Now in Idaho, many forests have specific standards to protect riparian areas, one of which requires 300-foot riparian buffers along each side of the road along a fish-bearing stream. Unfortunately, forests like the Nez Clear are trying to weaken those standards and allow logging within 150 feet of those streams. So really degrading the buffer strips. And also another note, climate change is having a huge effect on the effectiveness of these buffer strips and other best management practices. And the Forest Service has actually acknowledged and created a report about how climate change is reducing the effectiveness of those what are called BMPs or other design criteria or design features that we see in specific projects. Bottom line is, you just can't assume that a BMP or a design feature is going to be good enough to account for the increased precipitation and storm events and winter melt that we are seeing here on the Clearwater National Forest under climate change conditions. So again, kind of a side note there, Brett.
Yeah, really important. Riparian buffers, maybe in the policy world, also known as pack fish and infish, but otherwise, riparian buffers and so important, particularly here on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, where we're trying to recover salmon and steelhead and bull trout. And so those buffers and that water quality that you talked to, is so important. Now, certainly the other side of the coin, Adam, is just how the extensive road system on these national forests also harms wildlife and wildlife habitat. Backcountry roads combined with increased summer motorized and mechanized recreation is greatly fragmenting, and we're going to talk about that word, fragmenting important habitat, and also affecting wildlife movement and behavior. So I wanted to just ask you, is there a recommended road density, a ceiling for these forests? And if those thresholds are exceeded, if there are too many miles, are there certain wildlife species that are negatively affected more than others? Certainly the grizzly bear comes to mind.
Well, absolutely. Roads, by their very nature, fragment wildlife habitat. That is, they break it into smaller and smaller chunks to the point where the habitat no longer even functions the way it's supposed to and can't support wildlife and certainly impedes wildlife movement. Species like grizzly bears that need large areas of intact habitat to survive are especially at risk from roads, as well as motorized trails, especially when several miles are crammed into a small area. Now, to ensure grizzly bears can recover, roads and motorized trails are best combined into one category called motorized route density. Now, this is measured by the number of miles of routes in a square mile. So grizzly bears need open route densities to be less than 1 mile per square mile. Even if a road and trails are closed to motorized use, they still hinder grizzly bear recovery. And that's why biologists set a limit for total motorized route density that is both open and closed, which is 2 miles per square mile. Now, grizzly bears also need secure core habitat, which is a certain amount of acres away from any motorized disturbance or even high trail use. The combination of secure core habitat and limits for motorized route densities is necessary for both grizzly bear recovery and connectivity.
Well, certainly, we're just starting to have grizzly bears in many ways starting to recover on their own. And so this is something, you know, that Friends of the Clearwater and Wild Earth Guardians will be talking about hopefully for years to come, as we try, as hopefully more bears naturally recover here, and hopefully that coincides with more road decommissioning. But we just touched on some of the negative impacts between summer motorized and mechanized recreation. I want to again get to that other side of the coin, and there's also negative impacts from winter motorized recreation, which has also increased. There's been many scientific studies that point to the negative impacts that snowmobiles and other snow machines, as I like to call them, you know, can have on species like wolverines, as well as Canada lynx, you know, which are native to the Clearwater. I remember coming across one study that says the best available science believes that the second largest population of wolverines in the lower 48 is in the Clearwater and Salmon River drainages. So, you know, these species are teetering on the brink of extinction. Whether or not politically they're listed under the ESA, that's a different story. But could you please talk about some of the threats that motorized winter recreation in these two particular forests, the Nez Clear, have on these species? And I also want you to touch on mountain goats too, which sometimes can be overlooked.
Sure. The Nez Perce Clearwater is what we would call prime climate change refugia. That means it provides a safe haven from the harmful effects of climate change, especially along the Montana-Idaho divide. And, you know, there's other important places, of course, but that area, the Great Burn, is kind of near and dear to my heart, spending many backpacking trips out into that beautiful country. So, you know, species that need secure winter habitat are particularly at risk from what the Forest Service calls over snow vehicles. So that includes not only snowmobiles, but these new machines like motorcycles that have tracks instead of wheels. You know, these machines can go farther into remote areas, accessing places traditional snowmobiles even can't go. The noise and disturbance from motorized use harms a variety of species, no matter what machine you're driving. So grizzly bears with cubs are particularly at risk because the disturbance will cause them to leave their dens too early. Snowmobiles also increase the stress on Canada lynx and disturbs their ability to hunt. Wolverines are especially at risk because they need secure winter denning habitat to birth and rear their young. Over snow vehicles can cause wolverine mothers to simply abandon their dens, further reducing the chances of successful reproduction. Snowmobiling often overlaps with wolverine denning habitat, especially in high mountain cirque basins, where people like to high mark by driving their machines as far up the slope as they can go. These cirque basins are precisely where wolverines like to den. So the threat from over snow vehicles is also prevalent to mountain goats. It's pretty severe, in fact. Winter is a critical seasonal time period for mountain goat survival, especially since they face starvation during the winter. Often to conserve energy, mountain goats simply try to limit their movement to small winter ranges, but snowmobiles can chase them out of these places, which means they expend crucial energy, which increases their risk of starvation. You know, biologists have observed substantial declines in mountain goat population in areas with high snowmobile use. So it's no wonder that we're seeing places like in the Great Burn with declining mountain goat populations as they're getting displaced.
Yeah, we need to show some restraint, and we need to show some restraint awful fast, both reflected in our personal behaviors and in our national forest policies. This reminds me of a good book written by George Werthner, Adam, A Thrill Craft. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. It's a great coffee book.
It's sitting on our shelves.
Yeah, exactly. We've got numerous copies here in the office, but Adam and I, certainly I'll speak for Adam here in this one moment. Adam and I will certainly, you know, encourage people to get a copy of Thrillcraft, written by George Werthner. And so nonetheless, what I would like to do, Adam, and for those of you that are just joining the Wild Clearwater Country show today, We're joined by Adam Rissien, ReWilding Advocate of Wild Earth Guardians. Adam is joining us here, or rather out of Missoula, Montana. We're shooting a video today and also producing video, or rather audio, for today's radio show. So this is kind of cool. I want to just kind of bring all this around to forest planning, which is something, Adam, that you've been very involved, not only on the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, but also nationwide. I know you've been buried neck deep in comment periods for multiple forest plans around the country. It's one of the reasons why it's so great to have you as a guest today, because of your extensive knowledge on this very important issue. So most recently, FOC, Friends of the Clearwater, along with Wild Earth Guardians, and I think we had a coalition of 15 other groups and individuals. We recently submitted public comments, extensive public comments that were over 300 pages long to the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest for their forest plan revision. And so let's kind of tie it all together. Let's talk about the correlation between backcountry roads and a forest plan, and how is the large road system on these two forests, how is it managed through the forest plan, which of course is the overarching document that guides forest management and direction for anywhere up to 30 years.
Well, that's actually supposed to be double the life of a forest plan. In fact, the draft plan we saw from the Clearwater said it was a 15-year plan, which is actually what it's supposed to be. But you know, the reality is we're still being, the Nez Clear is still being managed under 1987 plans. So to put it in perspective, we've been seeing forest plan revision going full tilt throughout the American West. Even during this time of the pandemic, the Forest Service simply is not pausing one bit, and we saw that again with the Nez Clear. Going back to what a forest plan is and what it has, that could be its own show entirely, but just a quick point, all forest plans include a number of what are called components. Now, these are desired conditions, objectives, standards, and guidelines. And the standards are really important because they set specific requirements necessary for a variety of things, but especially to protect fish and wildlife habitat and the forest's overall ecological integrity. The draft plan we saw for the Nez Clear does have some components that address roads. For example, the draft plan had a desired condition that road maintenance and new road construction shall be designed to minimize adverse effects to threatened and endangered aquatic species and their habitat. While this is a good step, it's not nearly strong enough. It's a desired condition. It's not a standard. And you will note, it does not actually include the use of existing roads or reconstruction of stored roads, the 49% of stored roads on the forest. So overall, the plan lacks direction to really achieve a sustainable road system. For another example, the draft plan calls for decommissioning or storing just 30 miles of road every 5 years. Now, the life of the plan is supposed to be 15 years, right? So in total, that would be just 90 miles of road, decommissioned or stored. Now remember, there are over 7,600 miles of roads total on the forest, and over 3,800 miles are actually open. Now, decommissioning just 90 miles will do little to reduce road densities, and that's only if they actually decommission them effectively, meaning that if they store the roads, the actual densities won't decrease really at all. So clearly the agency needs to do better in this regard. Road density standards, or motorized route density standards, are really what is necessary to ensure the road system and motorized trail system doesn't harm fish and wildlife habitat. And unfortunately, this is where the draft plan really falls short. It has no density standards whatsoever. And in fact, we're seeing more and more forest plans that did have them get rid of them.
Well, so the next step, Adam, and with regard to the forest plan, so we just talked about how Friends of the Clearwater Wild Earth Guardians, a large coalition of citizens and groups, we just submitted comments on the draft environmental impact statement for the forest plan revision on the Nez Clear. We expect the final environmental impact statement, or the FEIS, to be released possibly at the end of this year, maybe early next year. My understanding is that there will be a small or short public comment period attached to it. And but I want to just step in your kind of your lens a little bit. What are you looking for when this final draft comes out, when it comes to rewilding the Nez Clear? And what are some of the standards, the measurable standards that you feel must be included in the final plan or the final draft in order to protect some of this crucial fish and wildlife habitat here on the federal public lands in north central Idaho?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not only because the draft plan is clearly short of what it needs to include, but also because of just the importance of the Nez Perce Clearwater Forest. So the final plan, in our view, must direct the Forest Service to identify and implement a minimum road system. Now that term is actually part of the travel management regulations that the Forest Service just wants to conveniently ignore as often as it can. That is a road system that is both ecologically and economically sustainable. And right now, the Nez Perce is clearly not economically sustainable. Even with nearly half the roads in storage, those roads still need some basic custodial maintenance. In looking at the analysis for the forest plan, I believe they had $60,000, $6 million per year available for the forest, which it actually needs much, much more than that in order to maintain over 7,000 miles of road. So clearly the forest is not economically sustainable. It's not ecologically sustainable. So to have a desired condition to identify and implement a minimum road system is clearly what is needed. The final plan must ensure removal of temporary roads and set standards to protect fish and wildlife from their construction and use. The final plan must include road and motorized trail density standards to help restore wildlife habitat, improve connectivity for a range of species, especially grizzly bears, and really achieve a minimum road system that is attained through effective decommissioning. In fact, the final plan should identify specific areas for grizzly bear connectivity and set standards to protect those areas. And finally, the plan must protect winter wildlife habitat from oversnow vehicles, especially wolverines and mountain goats. And this is especially true in roadless areas such as the Great Burn.
Well, this is a great time to just highlight to all of our viewers and listeners. I remember when I got hired 10 years ago with Friends of the Clearwater, it was bestowed upon me right away, very early, that the Clearwater Basin of north central Idaho is the northern part of the largest undeveloped watershed complex in the lower 48. And so we have a lot of roads on the landscape here. We've been discussing this throughout this whole interview. Compared to many other places in the West, this place, has less roads. However, what's counter to that is the native species, the amount of imperiled species that are here, that are threatened or endangered with extinction. And so the answer is to not build more roads because we have less than other national forests, but it's actually to decommission more here so that we can save bull trout and salmon and steelhead from going extinct. When it comes to grizzly bear recovery, Adam, you've touched on it a number of times in this interview. The Bitterroot recovery area is the future, is the linchpin, the key puzzle piece to recovery of the great bear in the Northern Rockies bioregion. Idaho Fish and Game just observed tracks that were confirmed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that indeed showed a grizzly bear is here on the Nez Perce National Forest as of last month, just April. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that the bear hibernated here. So species recovery and a road system that is both ecologically and economically sustainable, along with the forest plan, is absolutely crucial for the future of these federal public lands here in the Clearwater Basin of north central Idaho. So there's going to be a lot of attention paid to this particular part of the country, as we move forward. And speaking of moving forward, Adam, Friends of the Clearwater, we're greatly thankful to work with you and Wild Earth Guardians and our other allies on issues like the forest plan revision and grizzly bear recovery, as well as other issues. And I can't stress enough how important it is to focus on rewilding these forests, rewilding America. You hear people talking about rewilding their backyard. That's great. We need to rewild our public lands. And Adam, you do a tremendous job. And we're happy to work with you now and in the future. And let's get to work.
Well, I really appreciate the time here today with you, Brett, and your listeners. And just wanted to make one point of clarification, looking back at the numbers on road maintenance. I wanted to clarify that in 2014, the Forest Service estimated it needed $6.1 million just to maintain a portion of its road system, those open to passenger cars and what it calls high priority, high clearance roads. But the Forest Service only receives 20% of the necessary funding. So that translates into failed roads and degraded ecosystems. So just to clarify, the Forest Service can't afford the system it has. Rewilding the forest means removing those unnecessary roads or roads it can't afford, and doing so will provide great jobs and the necessary habitat for the recovery of not just grizzly bears, but all of those keystone species. So that's one of the things that we work with Friends of the Clearwater on the Nez Clear forest, because it's such a high value forest for a variety of species. And I really look forward to working with your organization further in the future, not just on the revised forest plan, but also on specific projects the Forest Service continuously proposes that threatens fish and wildlife habitat. So again, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you here today, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Yeah, Adam, thanks again for your time. And I want to thank everyone out there watching on video. Thank you for your support. And please consider becoming a member of Wild Earth Guardians, as well as a member of Friends of the Clearwater. The future is at stake, and extinction is real. And so let's prevent it from happening by having strong forest plans that protect wildlife and fish species and habitat, so that not only we can enjoy it in this generation, but for future generations. And so, Adam, I'll talk to you soon, and thanks again for your time.
All right, you have a great rest of the day, and thank you to all your listeners. Have a good day.
Okay, goodbye, Adam. Thank you.